Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. Would like to welcome all of you to today's conference that is organized in the context of our Austrian Studies program and is entitled Far-Right Politics in Austria, Europe and the United States, Recent Trends and Transatlantic Connections. This conference is organized in cooperation with the Botstiber Institute for Austrian American Studies, represented here by Michael Burry, and the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, represented by its director, Ambassador Wolfgang Pitwitch. Thanks to both of you for your support to this conference. I would also like to thank the following other institutions that agreed to co-sponsor our conference, namely the UC Berkeley Department of German, the UC Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, the UC Berkeley Institute of Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, the Austrian Agency for Education and Internationalization, and the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. Finally, I would like to thank the conference co-organizer, Professor Karin Liebhardt, all the conference participants, as well as my colleagues Ray Savard and Laura Morello, who have been assisting me and Karen in preparing this conference. I should also explain that this conference grew out of a new initiative here at Berkeley's Austrian Studies program, which was the creation of the Botstiber Visiting Professorship, which gives an opportunity to a faculty member from abroad to spend 5 weeks here with us on the Berkeley campus to teach a compact seminar on a topic related to Austrian studies broadly defined. More information on this fellowship can be found on the website of our Austrian Studies program at the Institute of European Studies here in Berkeley. This initiative was made possible thanks to the generous support of the Botstiber Institute for Austrian American Studies, and we're honored to have with us this year Professor Karin Liebhardt from the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna as our first Botstiber visiting professor here in Berkeley. Part of the agreement with the Botstiber Institute is that the visiting professor would also give a public lecture, and we're very excited that this year's Botstiber lecture will take place in the context of this conference. I will now give the floor to Professor Liebhardt, to Karen, and I will ask her to also give you some practical information about the conference. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to teach here in Berkeley, and a very warm welcome from me too. I would like to welcome all participants, of course the speakers, but especially the audience. We are very pleased that the conference is attracting so much interest. It was my pleasure to help organize this 2022 Austrian Studies Conference in my capacity as Botstiber Visiting Professor. And I'm also very pleased that the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, where I work, is a co-sponsor. I see this as a symbol of transnational cooperation and this conference as one of the transatlantic bridges. It is great that we have brought together such an excellent group of scholars, and I'm very much looking forward to the individual contributions. I would like to say a few words about the structure of the conference. There are 2 keynotes of 30 minutes at the beginning and at the end of the conference, and 3 sessions with each session, except session 3, being composed of 3 lectures of 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes Q&A and discussion. Session 3, which takes place in the afternoon, includes 4 papers of 15 minutes each, also followed by 15 minutes Q&A and discussion with the speakers. Regarding the QA and discussion session, due to the larger number of participants, I would like to ask everyone in the audience to post questions and comments in the chat and direct them direct to the moderator. These questions are then brought into the discussion by the moderators. Thank you all so much for being here. And I will now hand over to Michael and Kevin from the Potsdamer Institute for Austrian American Studies. We met last week at the Austrian Studies Conference in New Orleans along with David and Hannes, and I'm delighted to meet again here today.
Thank you, Karen. This is Michael Burry. I wanted to welcome the conference participants and the organizers on behalf of the Potsdamer Institute for Austrian American Studies. We're a Philadelphia-based foundation whose mission it is to promote an understanding of the historic relationship between Austria and the United States, including the lands of the Habsburg Empire. So this was a kind of a natural partnership for us with Berkeley and the Compact Seminar. We have 4 program areas: digital programming, we have some event grants, we have research grants, and we have the Journal of Austrian American History. I'm the editor of that. Kevin McNamara, our managing director, will be joining us later. Jeroen presented the Compact Seminar very well, so I'll just say that, you know, I met Professor Liebhardt-Kein last week in New Orleans. We're thrilled to have her as the first of the partnership with the Institute for European Studies at Berkeley and Austrian Studies, and I look forward to the conference, and I will send it back to Jeroen. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Michael. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Wolfgang Pitwitch, who was the EU's special envoy for Kosovo, also the EU chief negotiator at the Kosovo peace talks, and then high representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina. He's currently director of the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation and also chair of the Herbert Kellmann Institute for Interactive Conflict Resolution. We're very grateful for the support from the Marshall Foundation to today's conference, and for the fact that Ambassador Petritsch accepted our invitation to deliver the conference keynote. So thank you so much, Wolfgang, for this. After the presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A. All of you in the audience, you can participate in the conversation we will have with Wolfgang Petritsch after his lecture by posting your questions in the chat function on Zoom. And I, as moderator, will then pass on a selection of these questions to the ambassador after his presentation. But I will now give the floor to Ambassador Petritsch for a lecture entitled "A Watershed Moment for Europe's Democracy, the Twin Challenges of Authoritarian Populism and the Return of Weaponized Power Politics." Wolfgang, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Jeroen, for your kind words of introduction. Actually, I must say that I really pity you and the organizers of this conference, because how can one these days actually decide on a timely topic, as we seem to live, to paraphrase Lenin, in a time when decades happen in a week? And the question really is, are we experiencing, to put it differently, yet another acceleration of history? Now, from 9/11 onwards, the world seemed to have definitely left behind its Cold War stasis. The war on terror produced wars of choice and more terror, while the neoliberal faith in free markets, deregulation, and an unfettered financial industry, not any longer bothered by state intervention, have brought us the global financial crisis, a badly managed pandemic, the proliferation of hybrid conflicts, cyber attacks, and now the return of armed conquest. All in all, much fertile ground for the populist wave of the past 10 years. Now, enough of emotions, and we will return to it later on. Dear friends, today we cannot talk about the authoritarian populist turn in recent politics of Europe, the United States, and in the global West in general, without addressing Putin's war against Ukraine. This unprovoked and premeditated attack is a stark reminder that there is no such thing as a Kantian road to perpetual peace. The earlier hope that our ever-deepening connectivity, the product of digital innovation and technological modernization, would lead to a world in which ideological barriers were rendered irrelevant, where ratio beats emotion, this has vanished overnight. Now, enlightened economic self-interest has again been trumped by brute force. The adage of Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, the pervasive view that by engaging economically with Russia would build a Europe whole and free, has clearly failed. The marketplace as a democratic transformer, this simplistic neoliberal notion has obviously not worked with Putin's Russia. Will it work after Putin? I personally doubt it. Now, a tenuous rapprochement in the name of transformative interdependence has turned out to be another giant European miscalculation. Only recently, German federal president and former foreign minister Jochen Steinmeier, one of the masterminds behind this approach, apologized for alleged past policy mistakes. He was nevertheless uninvited by his Ukrainian counterpart, an understandable but ultimately unwise move by Ukraine's embattled president. Now, the tacit acceptance that relations with an ever more autocratic Russia, with quite some support even within and from the European Union, would eventually be corrected by ever closer economic connectivity. Just think of Nord Stream 2, will undoubtedly qualify as a textbook case how not to conduct international relations. There's yet another observation that I would like to share with you. In recent decades, Russia has been badly hit by the failure of two materialist utopias. First, by the Leninist promise for a good life of the working class under communism, and then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the capitalist promise of an ever better life for all. In Russia, particularly, the dubious results of the Washington Consensus, engineered by Western shock therapists, has hit a society wholly unprepared for fair and productive privatization. The oligarchs of today, some of them from the former Soviet nomenclatura, have generated what Karl Marx described as original accumulation. Now, this in turn has set off the still ongoing process of capital accumulation in Russia's kleptocratic system. Both utopias, Lenin's and Yeltsin's, have collapsed, resulting in a return to old-fashioned nationalist politics, Putin style. It is the dream of a renewed Tsarist Russia, not of Lenin's Soviet Empire, that has led Putin into Ukraine. Not that we in the West have been free of policy blunders. Quite the opposite is true. Take the sole hyperpower of the immediate post-Cold War era and how it wasted its unipolar moment. The US wars of choice in Afghanistan and Iraq, a bloody regime change in Libya, albeit led from behind, and the dramatic policy failings in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, not to forget the devastating images from Abu Ghraib and the still not closed detention camp in Guantanamo. Add to this the legalized, must say, legalized use of torture and the black sites throughout Europe and elsewhere, or the still ongoing drone strike assassination program and the mass surveillance of its own population and allied governments. This fatal fallout from triumphalist hubris are an indelible stain on America's consciousness. These, of course, extend to Europe as the proverbial innocent bystander. This change of policy errors, or worse, of crimes, in the name of an ill-devised war on terror were ominous precursors of the destruction of the post-1945 liberal order, a demise highlighted by the botched exit from Afghanistan's forever war. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the much maligned adage of the end of history of liberal democracy as the Hegelian final state of our globalized world has again been proven utterly false. There is no end, but rather an uncertain return to a Hobbesian world, further away from Kant's perpetual peace than ever. Of course, Immanuel Kant has written about peace so eloquently in his native Königsberg, now Russia's westernmost enclave of Kaliningrad. To preserve peace and foster human development through economic cooperation, to establish global networks with a competitive yet fair global system now appear to be but a pipe dream. It has been said so often. The 24th of February 2022 marks yet another turning point, Zeitenwende, in world politics. Russia's war against Ukraine is not just a local conflict. It is essentially European, and it is even a global confrontation, I would add. Now, for me, Russia and Ukraine is a fundamental conflict on the interface between militarized power politics and aggressive identity politics. By attacking the democratically elected government in Kyiv, Moscow wants to stop the westward movement of Ukraine, a state historically at the crossroads between Europe's west and east, I should add, geopolitical gray zone. In order to better comprehend the complex vicissitudes of our time, characterized by rising populist authoritarianism and the receding attraction of democracy, a look at the underlying reasons behind these closely linked phenomena is warranted. Now, just this, according to a recent global survey, there are, again, more authoritarian regimes than liberal democratic governments around in 2022, a populist triumph of sorts. Now, dear friends, as a kind of prelude to this conference, I have chosen to approach this topic along the lines of two intertwined narratives. The first one I call the political economy of emotions. Here we are back to emotions, which I mentioned at the beginning. And secondly, intervulnerability as a possible new paradigm of globalization. The first is what I call the political economy of emotions, and let me say a few words about it. Emotion, as I see it, is the paradigmatic other of rationality. We frequently speak of rational political actors. There, Putin before the Ukrainian invasion comes to mind. Hence, we were incredulous when he started a war under the pretext of preventing genocide against Russians in Ukraine, of denazification, of demilitarization, and finally on the grounds that Ukraine has no right to exist as a sovereign state. It is a popular truism that every war starts with a big lie. This one is no different. As someone who is professionally involved in resolving the conflict on the territory of the former Yugoslavia, I must admit that all these vacuous reasons put forward by Moscow immediately reminded me of another conflict about identity and territory some 30 years ago. As in Russia, the Yugoslav Wars were foreshadowed in the writings of so-called intelligentsia. In 1986, the Serbian Academy of Science issued a report about the alleged suppression of their kin in post-Tito Yugoslavia and warned of an imminent genocide of the Serbs in Kosovo. Historians of Yugoslavia's violent breakup consider this report a crucial, a decisive contribution to the nationalist narrative that destroyed the multi-ethnic Balkan state. Sadly, genocide did occur a decade later. However, the place was Srebrenica, committed by the Bosnian Serb army on the Muslim Bosniaks. Their national identity was first verbally and in writing contested years earlier by Serb ethno-nationalist psychiatrist and poet Radovan Karadzic. Putin, I would assume, does not need the Russian Academy of Sciences to provide intellectual cover for his war against Ukraine. For him, it suffices to quote Ivan Ilyin, who lived from 1883 to 1954. Ilyin wrote about religious and nationalist dictatorship, or Putin could also and will, I guess, and has conferred with Alexander Dugin, his favorite contemporary crypto-fascist philosopher, the leading thinker of a greater Russia. Now, words matter, and emotions trump rationality. Now, my dear friends, it is by now a well-established fact that with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the successful Brexit campaign of Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson in the same year, the populist international had reached its tentative high point. Similarities and sympathies abound between American and European far-right populists. What's more concerning are the strange affections for Putin and his ever more dictatorial Russia displayed by Trump even after the start of the war. The former president fawned over the Russian autocrat's savvy and genius move to recognize the breakaway eastern parts of Ukraine. Only one day before the actual invasion began, Trump praised the smart move by sending, and this is a quote, "the strongest peace force I've ever seen to the area." Now, meanwhile, in autocratic Hungary, Viktor Orban, another fan of Putin's, has won a landslide election victory and continues to defy the European Union sanctions regime against Russia. French right extremist presidential contender Marine Le Pen is a close second to Emmanuel Macron in next Sunday's final round of presidential elections in France. She has just announced her readiness for a rapprochement between France and Russia, of course, after she moves to the Élysée. Now, on the other hand, Russia's aggression against Ukraine has had a sobering effect on several countries with traditionally pro-Russian sentiments such as Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria. The electorate in the Czech Republic, with its Russophile president, has just outvoted the populist and notoriously corrupt millionaire prime minister, himself an admirer of Putin's. The same has happened to Bulgaria's Prime Minister Borisov, another corrupt beneficiary of the EU's largesse for its poorest member. Now, I'm not going to address the rather brief populist moment in Austria, which ended in a huge, still ongoing corruption scandal. I assume Austria will be addressed by my Austrian colleague, Karin. Now, these examples, including Austria's, and encouraging signs indeed in an otherwise rather bleak political landscape. Soon after the recent general elections in Bulgaria and in the Czech Republic, the ousted incumbents were temporarily apprehended and charged for their corrupt practices. So not all hope for electoral democracy is lost, I would say. Even the weak European Union checks and balances seem to work on occasion. Now, my dear friends, while the term populism signifies anti-establishment, anti-politics in its broadest sense, void of any particularly humanistic idea, typically places attitude over content. Populism is primarily associated with particularly moods and emotions, writes Jan Werner Müller in his introduction to What is Populism of 2016. But there is a transatlantic difference of meaning in the usage of this term. In the United States, populism before Trump was traditionally associated with egalitarian left-wing politics, mainstream versus Wall Street, so to speak. In Europe, by contrast, the term evokes authoritarian sentiments. Yes, and populism is essentially anti-pluralistic. Populists strive for identity in its most exclusive form and are thus inherently anti-liberal. The main adversary is, and this is very important, representative democracy. These clarifications, dear friends, are necessary when addressing a conference that deals with these phenomena on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, despite these differences, populism was clearly given a boost in both places by the excesses of globalization. Just think of the outsourcing of over the past 20 years, and to the growing gap between prosperous elites and middle and lower class income workers who feel threatened by international competition and local neglect. Consequently, the state of democracy is rather bleak, according to the recently released Democracy Report 2022 by Gothenburg University's V. Dem Institute. In fact, liberal democracy has been deteriorating for quite some time and is now down to 1989 levels. Democratic advances over the past 30 years have effectively been eradicated. Now, clearly, populism is a major contributing factor in promoting toxic polarizations. Emotions dominate and infringing on the practice of deliberative discourse. Electoral autocracy, what a term, remains the most common regime type. It harbors about 44% of the world's population. Now, the European Union is facing its own wave of autocratization. According to the institute from Gothenburg, 20% of the polled EU states now fall under this category. The report lists the Czech Republic, Greece, Croatia, Slovenia, Poland, and of course Hungary as autocratizing. EU candidates, Serbia and Turkey, are part of this downward spiral. Now, it provides no comfort that the United States is also listed as an autocratizing country in this report from Sweden. Now, quite the opposite, the emotionally charged and confrontative Trump years have dealt a dramatic blow to democratic practices in the United States, arguably the most important psychological driver of autocratization around the globe. What we are witnessing, from the territorial aspirations of Putin for Greater Russia to the populist support behind Trump and Brexit, is the phenomenon of leaders and voters increasingly acting out powerful emotions. And these are nationalism, populism, nativism, and religious fervor. Now, let me turn to my second parameter, dear friends, along which I would like to structure my remark. And this is intervulnerability, an ugly neologism indeed, but one that has gained currency over the past weeks when the weaponization of power politics, the return to the use of hard power, of military power in Europe, not seen since the 1990s, has become reality in Ukraine. An all too stark reality, I should add. And this reality has forever changed the eastern neighborhood of the European Union. Let me say that whether the promise of European Union membership for Ukraine and in extension to Georgia and the Republic of Moldova will ever materialize is a matter for Brussels' long-term planning. It's not going to be easy. Just consider the potential to redefine Europe's finalité politique, including its eastern borderline. Now, while Western focus is on Russia's military attack on the Ukraine and how to deal with it, the ripple effects of the war could be felt immediately, not only in the neighboring region of Europe, but in seemingly far away places like the Middle East and North Africa, whose populations depend heavily on grain and other foodstuffs imported from Ukraine and Russia. In addition to the notoriously weak states of the region, think of the Arab Spring of 2011, triggered by rising bread prices. The looming food crisis is a prime example of the intervulnerability in our globalized world. Now, oil and particularly gas from Russia powers Europe's industry and private households, I should add. The dependency is massive. Let's just take Austria. It buys close to 80% of its gas from Russia. Germany is no better off. Nord Stream 2 is, in this respect, a symbol of Europe's failed energy policy. The price of gasoline has risen sharply all over Europe, and so has inflation, which has reached levels not seen since the first oil shock of 1973. The socio-economic consequences are alarming. Already in 2020, the United Nations and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, have warned, and I quote, that the sharp economic downturn could further aggravate food insecurity and political tensions in North Africa and in the wider Middle East. The figures presented at this week's spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. reinforce the negative outlook for global food security. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, countries where Western interventions took place, are now considered failed states. Whose responsibility, we may ask, and we know the answer. These are but a few examples of how intervulnerability in our global ecosystem plays out. For the purpose of today's theme, it needs to be emphasized how seriously the international order itself, by which I mean the post-1945 system of institutionalized multilateralism, is in dire straits. The United Nations, specifically the Security Council, urgently needs a radical makeover along the paradigm of interdependence, connectivity, and intervulnerability. Obviously, in times when the war in Ukraine is grinding on without no end in sight, when great power competition with China has migrated to the Indo-Pacific, and any such proposal, of course, sounds idealistic, if not to say naive. I know, I'm very much aware of this. Still, there's no way out of this shared and often existential challenge, including climate change, pandemic diseases, economic and financial crisis, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the arms control and disarmament treaties in shambles, not to mention the so-called new threats of cyber warfare. Now, these challenges can only be tackled through international cooperation. But above all, what it needs is the will of peoples and governments to seriously cooperate to prevent a total collapse of planet Earth. Now, in concluding, let me again switch back to history. President Zelensky's recent appeal to the Security Council is sadly reminiscent of Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie's historic address to the League of Nations in June of 1936. Part of the failure of the League of Nations was its inability to retain the participation of all the great powers. The two-tier system of the United Nations, established at the end of the Second World War, secured the participation of the great powers, including the Soviet Union, but at an immense cost. Today, the UN remains a forum for airing grievances. It is still excels in some important cooperative endeavors, but it cannot be used as an instrument for military intervention against the interests, let alone the actions of any one of the permanent members of the Security Council, no matter how egregious the breach of international law. And in the background lurks the present danger of tactical nuclear bombs. Putin is quite obviously testing the limits of our system. There's no simple solution to the crisis in Ukraine or to the other global challenges facing us. Emotions on all sides make it difficult to remind ourselves how vulnerable we are in this interconnected world. It is painfully obvious, however, that in the short run, and as long as the war ravages on, Europe and the United States must continue to increase their multi-pronged assistance to Ukraine and ratchet up their sanctions on Russia. If the Russian onslaught has a silver lining, then in the fact that Putin's war appears to discredit his European supporters and may well provide, in the longer term, a new impetus for European unity. But it could also go the other way. If and when the ongoing price hikes and the surging inflation hit the living standards of an already alienated populace. Here again, the paradigms of emotion and vulnerability align. Now, my dear friends, democratic resilience, a strategy to counter authoritarian populism, can only be achieved through a government that robustly acts to provide essential services by fostering public common goods, to secure meaningful employment, strengthen the rule of law, and guarantee better citizen participation. How, my dear friends, such laudable goals can be achieved is indeed part of the purpose of your conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. This was really an excellent presentation for so many reasons, for its eloquence, for its wealth of ideas, but also I think for addressing so many points that we will have a chance to further discuss in the context of our conference. So thank you so much for this. Wolfgang, I noticed that there's already a couple of questions from my colleagues in the chat, but if you allow me to just start the Q&A with a reference to France, because all of us are also looking at the upcoming presidential elections, and you mentioned the case of France in connection to Russia, but I have a quick question for you in relation to the European Union. And Wolfgang, if we were to imagine the unimaginable, right? That Le Pen happens to be elected as the new president of France. Could you share with us your thoughts on the impact this would have on the EU and the norms and values that the EU represents?
Well, this really escapes my fantasy, I must say. It's unimaginable, actually, but nevertheless, we know this from 2016 when Trump was elected. And I still remember, Jeroen, I was in Berkeley in the summer, and we spoke about it. And I could feel, actually, there was not a lot of interest or concern about Trump being able to win the elections. And that was in the summer of 2016. Now, of course, in France, we are much closer to this kind of event. But here, I must say, I really trust the French, how should I say, maybe this kind of Republican consciousness that the citizens of France espouse, that they know that this is a decision, and this was already, of course, 5 years ago, the same, which must not go awry. I mean, this is just a bit of a consolation, or a hope, I should say rather. What would happen? This would, I mean, change the European Union in such a way that it would, yes, as I said before, be unimaginable for most of the leaders there. I think it would pose the biggest challenge for Germany. Which would be left as the only big power in the European Union to handle the situation. How? I don't know. I think it would lead to a further isolation of French president. I don't believe it would really have in the short term an irreversible impact, I should say. Maybe the European Union, we as the members of the European Union have learned from the Hungarian experience. For far too long, Orban was not really taken seriously. Clearly, it cannot be, the size and importance of the country cannot be compared with Hungary for France. That's very clear. But maybe precisely because of this, there would be a very strong reaction to all of this. How this would be handled, I don't know. I must say, I'm only hoping and I'm hopeful that this will not happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Wolfgang. Yeah. Let me at this point pass on some questions, Wolfgang, to you from the audience. And the first one relates to ideology. So if trust through trade, if that failed, if communism failed, and Putin managed to consolidate his power to pseudo-democratic changes to the Russian constitution, the question then is, what ideological options are left for the liberal order? How would you answer that question?
Well, my feel is that the so-called liberal order, which never was liberal in its by definition, there were always other things that even in the so-called liberal democracies, this was not something which really had a liberal meaning. Let's just let's think of in Europe of the migration crisis of 2015 and afterwards. I think that was also a big blow to the liberal liberal idea. Actually, I think all the ideas of democracy promotion, of the universalist idea of liberalism, we need to revisit this. I think for the time being, we need to very much focus, and this was part of my speech, to really make liberal democracy resilient there where it's still alive, where it still works. That's very important. And I think that the United States will play a crucial role. And my greatest concern, I've expressed this in my speech, is really, what will be not only now in the November midterms, but then when the presidential elections in 2 years are around again. Are we going to fall? Is the United States going to fall back to Trump or to a Trump-like figure? Or will the Democrats prevail? This is a great concern in Europe in general, maybe phrased into the question, can we trust the United States? And I think, yes, we should, we need, but we must not be naive. I think we need to prepare, as we have not done in the case of Russia, and there's no comparison in there, but with the United States, I think it is necessary to think in terms of what can we do for ourselves? How can we strengthen liberal democracy in Europe, in the European Union? And I think in this respect, Hungary and of course also Poland, also the other countries that I have mentioned, we need to take this backsliding, democratic backsliding, much, much more seriously than we have done it so far. For too long, and I repeat this, for too long we have looked at Orban as a strange figure and have thought, okay, let him do what he wants. We have not seen the devastating effects of corruption, for example, of buying the voters, of establishing a kleptocracy in Budapest and in the outskirts. This, I think, there we will need more, how should I say, smart power, actually, how to counter this. That's something which I'm convinced that unless Brussels, and then when I say Brussels, I mean the heads of state and government who comprise the Council, the European Council, they need to act in a way which is not only nationally, but they need to act in a European way. Otherwise, I see really serious problems which will surmount the challenges that we have right now with Russia, because it will play out in the European Union itself.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Let me pass on to you another question, and maybe your experience from working in the Balkans will help you answering this difficult question. Question is, if Russia were to succeed in occupying Eastern Ukraine, do you think this would just be a prelude to a resumption of war at a later stage?
Well, it might as well be, but it will very much depend on the resolve on the part of Ukraine, of course, whatever will be left Ukraine. I think what we have seen actually is a nation building, Ukrainian nation building under duress, under war conditions, so to speak. And of course, also on the resilience of the Europeans and the Americans. Democracies are not in for the long term when it comes to resolve such difficult and tricky questions. But I believe that we need to see that this is actually the challenge of, it sounds a bit exaggerated, of the century, but it will definitely be decisive for the future of the European Union, for the future of the so-called West, which in a way has now a certain renaissance, and definitely also for the role of Europe and the United States in a changing world order. The big elephant in the room, of course, is China. How will China in the end react to all of this? Is China going to be the profiteer in all of this? Or will it realize actually that by destroying the current order, China might be worse off? Because China, with this system, the new Silk Road, depends very much on rules-based partners through those through which and the countries the road, the Chinese road leads. So unless China supports this kind of system, rules-based system, it will suffer. And I think there is enough wisdom around in Beijing to realize this. Maybe now Beijing is sitting on the fence. Some say Beijing is sitting in a chair or on a sofa and watching. But eventually it will have to take some tough decisions in this respect. So this in turn makes the newly revived transatlantic relationship the more so important. On the one hand, Europe has to become far more assertive. The peace project European Union needs to be, so in a way, armed. It needs to be reinforced by hard power. On the other hand, the transatlantic relationship also needs to be reinforced, but at a different level. It is not the junior partner any longer that Europe can should remain. And on the other hand, we need to see that actually the Indo-Pacific is so much more important for the United States. So there, a new equilibrium needs to be identified. Just think of recently in the Solomon Islands, China has a strategic cooperation now with the Solomon Islands. So this, in a way, is a clear indicator of China's longer-term strategy in the region. So these are some of the points that I believe we need to think much more now in global terms, in global strategic terms, in order to comprehend what is necessary in the future for Europe and how the transatlantic relationship can be reinforced, and simultaneously America's pivot to the Indo-Pacific is not hampered by this.
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang. We still have a couple of minutes, so let me pass on to you another question from the audience. This question is related to the United Nations, and you mentioned in your presentation the need for reforming the Security Council and how the United Nations operates. And the question is, how do you suggest this happens? Could you mention to us a concrete change on how to make the Security Council more effective?
Well, this is a big story, and Heidi, everybody dealing with this would need much more time to do this. But I think what would be a good first move where a majority could be garnered would be to strengthen the role of the General Assembly. That was not foreseen in 1944-45, but now with the membership, I think that would be extremely important to reflect and analyze what the General Assembly could do. Just think of the vote on Russia's aggression. 141 votes in the in the General Assembly condemning the aggression is quite remarkable. Of course, at the same time, by analyzing this a bit closer, you see that the big countries have refrained. China, India also. What kind of, and India is a very important point now also for the West in general, what kind of democracy, liberal democracy, or whatever, with the Hindu nationalism of Modi, is India soon to be the most populous country in the world? Is India still a partner of the West or not? Is it shifting away? I doubt it, because for India, China is so much more important as an adversary. So the West is actually United States and also Europe. It's actually these regions and states and countries that India counts on. Yeah? But nevertheless, this is something which needs to come into, which has to be factored into a reform of the system of the United Nations. And clearly there have been also efforts to reform the Security Council. I mean, the veto power is a big problem. One could imagine a veto -1, but then you have, of course, still Russia and China who would probably support each other. You could see, you could look for an enlargement. Several years ago, Germany was trying, Japan is a partner, you need South Africa and so on. So maybe there is also something which warrants closer scrutiny.
Thank you, Wolfgang. We still have a couple of minutes, so let me ask you one more question. You spoke in your presentation about strengthening liberal democracy in Europe. And one member in the audience then followed up and asked if you also then see a need for a change in economic policies in Europe to achieve this goal. If so, could you mention an example of such a change?
Yes. I mean, the interesting thing is that in spite of the financial crisis and the way the neoliberalism floundered in 2007, 2008, 2009, but it still lives on. And for example, it still lives on in the European Commission, and contributed quite decisively to the botched approach in the case of Greece, for example. Yeah, when you think of Greece now, the deficit there is still much higher than it used to be at the time of the outbreak of the crisis. So there are these questions that need to be addressed, and clearly in the context of populism, of the way people view liberal democracy, things need to happen. For me, the Polish example is quite indicative. How come that a government in Poland, the liberal conservative government, which did not experience, not even in times of the financial crisis, an economic crisis, it still had growth, yeah, as the only European country, I must add, and still the government was voted out. Why? Because its social policy was abominable. They really followed the neoliberal. Balcerowicz, finance minister, was one of the main actors in all of this, but they really followed this kind of shock therapy by really abandoning the rests of what was left in social protection from communist times. Yeah? And now the Kaczynski government since years is quite successful. Why? Because it has introduced minimal wages. It has, so to speak, dealt with re-establishing certain social measures that are important for exactly these people who tend to support populist governments. Yeah. So there, I believe the European Union will have a task to perform, and this is unless the European Union develops towards a social union, the European Union will have big difficulties, continues to have big difficulties. Why? Because the historic experience, particularly in the western part of Europe, is the social welfare state of post-1945. And neoliberalism, of course, is very much against this kind of, less state and all these issues. Now, in the pandemic, we have seen the state obviously is necessary. A certain institutional setup for the common good is necessary. But the European Union as such has not really and fundamentally corrected this approach. It will take time, but this is yet another very serious task that Brussels has to perform.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I see that there's more questions coming up in the chat. The more you speak, of course, the more questions come up among the audience. But I look at the clock and I see that it is here, at least in California, 11 o'clock. So I will conclude your keynote, your Q&A with a big thank you, Wolfgang, for an excellent presentation. Also with a big thank you for your support to this conference and to our Austrian Studies program here in Berkeley. So thank you so much.
I thank you very much, and I will continue to listen to the conference. However, it's already 8 o'clock at night here in Austria, so I will unfortunately not be able to listen to the very end, but I wish